What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, my name is Jessica, and in each of these videos I sit down here with you guys and we discuss a different true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds fun to you, I'd say subscribe, stick around, and join me back here each week. The combination may not be for you, and if that's the case, I do have some links down in the description for you. But for those of you who are sticking around, let's go ahead and get into today's case. Y'all, oh, I hate this story. I mean, obviously, I hate all of these stories, but I don't know, man. Something about the killers in today's case specifically, they give me the absolute fucking creeps. Today, we're going to be discussing the absolutely vile and horrific story of the Broken Arrow murders. This story came highly requested from a sweet subscriber named Jennifer, so if you could all join me in extending a big thank you out to Jennifer, I would certainly appreciate it. Thank you, Jennifer. But also, why, Jennifer? These boys, they're so yucky. In all honesty, though, this is why I really do value and appreciate the case request form, because it really does force my hand to cover cases that I normally wouldn't, cases I would normally avoid. So overall, I do think that it helps to kind of round out the channel, you know? So with that said, and without further ado, these clowns. Oh, actually, one more thing. I would be remiss not to mention that the entire point of why these two stupid idiots did what they did was so that they could become famous. And while I do fear that I could be feeding into that just by making this video, please understand that that is not in any way, shape, or form my intention. No, my intention here today is to honor and to remember the victims in this story. You know, they shouldn't have their story lost or forgotten just in an effort to avoid speaking about the monsters who took their lives. This is actually a whole dialogue that I've gone through in my own head and why I've hesitated to cover stories like the Columbine shooting, despite the fact that I've received multiple requests to do so. I understand that people don't want to give today's perpetrators nor the Columbine shooters the notoriety that they wanted to gain by carrying out these horrific acts. But like I said, I also worry that in trying to avoid doing that, do we run the risk of allowing the victims and what they endured to also be forgotten? Because you could argue that you don't really have one without the other. Anyway, that is a whole different discussion for a whole other day. Perhaps it's a good talking point for my Columbine video, if and when I do ever decide to tackle that. But for now, let us unpack the massive story that is the Broken Arrow murders. All right, so we are headed to Oklahoma today. Specifically, we're hopping in our time machine and we're heading all the way back to Oklahoma circa the late 1900s. No, I'm just kidding. We're headed to the 90s, which I guess technically speaking, according to Gen Z, is the late 1900s. However, I also think that I can safely speak for all millennials in saying, please stop referring to it like that. Seriously. It's hurtful. Y'all out here running around TikTok disrespecting your elders. Respect your damn elders, you rascals.
I'm old.
Robert Davis Bever and Michael John Bever were born in September 1996 and November 1998, respectively. They were the first two children out of 7 total children born to their parents, David and April Bever. So altogether, it went Robert, Michael, Crystal, Daniel, Christopher, Victoria, and Autumn. 7 kids, in addition to David and April, thus completing Bever Party of 9. And of course, cliche as it sounds from the outside looking in, as we frequently say at the beginning of all of these stories, everything about the Bever family seemed completely unremarkable, we'll say. I certainly can't say that they were totally normal, because they were definitely a little different, but there was certainly nothing about the family that would have led anyone to believe that they were in for everything we're about to discuss here today. David, the family's patriarch, worked as a computer analyst and a computer programmer for Samson Resources. He did that in order to support the family, while April, the family's matriarch, stayed home and she homeschooled the kids. All in all, the family kept a relatively low profile. They weren't really the type to spend much, if any time, socializing with their neighbors or out around their peers. Don't get me wrong, they didn't really cause problems. As a matter of fact, one of their neighbors later went on to say that they were actually the perfect neighbors because they were so quiet and they kept so much to themselves. But that wasn't the overall consensus, exactly. Because the family kept so tightly to themselves and almost seemingly went out of their way to avoid social interaction, this, in turn, led most of their neighbors to perceive them as antisocial and standoffish. They maybe even came across as a little arrogant. People barely even ever saw them, so forget ever actually getting to know them. Honestly, it wasn't until this whole story came out that a lot of people even actually learned all of the Bever family members' names. And while, sure, being private and keeping to themselves, that was their prerogative, but the fact of the matter was that in an attempt to keep a low profile, they actually sort of ended up sticking out like sore thumbs in their community. Their way of life was just not typical, specifically for the area in which they were living. The Bevers lived at 709 Magnolia Court, located in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, a town that is known, in stark contrast to the Bevers, for being very open and very friendly. The quintessential everyone knows everyone type of place. Located just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, Broken Arrow rests on roughly 60 square miles of land, hosting a population of just about 120,000 people. According to brokenarrow.gov, Broken Arrow, which, by the way, is the fourth largest city in the entire state, offers a high quality of life characterized by low crime, high-performing schools, affordable housing, and easy access to many parks and recreational facilities. And all of that sounds incredible, right? Low crime, good schools, affordable housing, tons of outdoor crap to do. I'd say sign me up, but well, for starters, I'm actually pretty indoorsy, so I'm not down for all the outside stuff. But putting that fact aside, it's also clearly not exactly all it's cracked up to be, considering, here we sit. And the Bever children, they weren't just cut off from the world due to the fact that they were homeschooled. Realistically, if you do it right, even being homeschooled, there are tons of opportunities for socialization among children. Actually, I'm fairly certain that I read that there was a homeschool co-op right within their own little community. So the problem wasn't so much the homeschooling as it was their parents, specifically April. Evidently, April, in particular, wanted her kids kept away from the influence of the outside world as much as humanly possible. The family, again, specifically April, was very dedicated to their Christian faith. April and David lived strictly and devoutly by the word of the Bible, so they were beyond determined to ensure that each and every one of their children grew up to hold the same values that they did. Robert's first job was even working at a religious call center, praying over strangers who called in seeking support. So yeah, big fans of the big guy upstairs, the Bevers. So obviously, these parents had some relatively extreme views and extreme outlooks on parenting. And April even went so far as to post some of her opinions and her philosophies onto different Reddit forums in an effort to help other parents. And then as far as David was concerned, well, according to some of the children, David was apparently borderline abusive. So operating under the assumption that that's true, given that the Bever children grew up so very isolated and didn't necessarily have the best relationship with their parents, well, suffice it to say that these siblings pretty much only had each other to lean on. I mean, truthfully, they only really knew each other. They only really spent time with, you guessed it, each other. And building off of that, I don't know if it's because they were the oldest or because they had the most in common or what it was specifically, but from what I could gather, Robert and Michael were pretty much always the closest. They were the best of friends. It is very clear in looking into this case that Michael looked up immensely to his older brother, and therefore he kind of followed pretty much everything and anything that Robert ever did. Any interests that Robert had, Michael adopted. Any hobbies that Robert pursued, Michael was right there behind him. And what's really ironic about this is that most of these interests and these hobbies were sought out or pursued via the internet. And I say that's ironic because in my opinion, considering how terrified April was about the outside world corrupting her children. She then turned around and allowed them completely unfettered access to the internet. Whether it was YouTube, Minecraft, Roblox, or what have you, they had access to everything, and they were never supervised while indulging in it. And while personally, this is a level of freedom that I wouldn't advise any parent dole out to their kids, I am also absolutely nobody, so who am I to be giving out parenting advice? Sure, the Bever boys' internet consumption might have started out innocently enough, gaming and posting silly videos to YouTube. However, it most certainly did not stay that way for long. Somehow, things appear to have quickly gone from Robert posting innocent YouTube videos, talking about Minecraft, to the boys researching and obsessing over serial and spree killers. We're talking people like Bundy, Ramirez, Manson, the Columbine shooters, the Aurora Theater shooter, etc., etc. And with that, I'm going to stop right here for a second, because, hello, I think we all know my Google history ain't that wholesome. But rest assured, this was not just morbid curiosity or a fascination in the macabre like you or I have. No, this was much more of these jackasses wanted to be famous like these jackasses. Now, obviously, you and I know that none of these horrific monsters are famous per se. I mean, if anything, I guess you could consider them infamous, but famous, infamous, notorious, whatever you want to call them, I guess this wasn't a distinction that the Bever brothers were exactly concerned with. Sure, normal people, relatively speaking, people like you or I, we can clearly discern the difference. We can easily understand that these are not the types of people that anyone should be idolizing. However, in that same vein, we also have to remember that the Bevers did not have the same access to the outside world, nor did they probably have any of the same real-life experiences that you or I have had. They barely knew anything outside of their metaphorical four walls. So when they're watching and reading about and taking in this stuff, they have precious little to compare it to. I think they were easily able to convince themselves that this was really actually something to strive for, something for them to aspire to. And this is why parenting really is so goddamn scary. If you don't strike this exactly perfect balance of protecting your children, but also letting them experience life, dude, it can be a recipe for disaster. And devastatingly, in this particular case, disaster is exactly how things would end up. Through this distorted and sheltered view of the world and these boys' ass backwards way of thinking, because of their completely deluded understanding of the real world, these brothers were actually able to convince themselves that by going on this murder spree that they were dreaming of, they believed that they were going to be doing the world a favor. They convinced themselves that in doing this, they would be helping to clean up our overpopulated planet by brutally killing anyone that they felt wasn't contributing enough to it to be here. And what's even sadder about that whole philosophy is that this wasn't even some deep theory that the boys came up with by themselves. Trust me, these kids had not an original bone in their bodies. No, all of this bullshit that they were spouting simply stemmed from Robert's fascination with the movie Rampage. Now, I've never seen it, but I guess in the movie, the main character gives this monologue that essentially spoon-fed the boys their little misguided ideology. An ideology that then led the boys into their plans to become mass murderers. With the money that Robert pulled in from his job at the call center, he slowly began to stockpile weapons, knives specifically, as well as body armor. And while that alone is terrifying enough, what's even scarier is the fact that they were not planning on stopping at that. This kid, I mean, technically he's an adult because he's 18, but he's a kid as far as brain development goes. Nevertheless, though, he had this full-on list of different weapons and different ammo, different types of armor accessories. He had a notebook with this just ever-growing shopping list of all the things that he needed to buy and procure in order for he and his little brother to just start killing people. Or, rampaging, as Michael would later so eloquently describe it. Yeah, that was their plan. They wanted to kill their family, steal their parents' Yukon, and just head across the country, wiping people out. 500, to be exact. That was their goal. They wanted to kill 500 people. To think that your own children could be planning something like this behind your back, save for their little sister Crystal, who was just 13 at the time. All of this planning and this stockpiling up on weapons, every horrible thing that these brothers were working towards and planning for, every bit of it went completely unnoticed by April and David. Even when Crystal brought up to her parents that her creepy brothers were starting to freak her out, from the outside looking in, these boys seemed like they were decent kids. They were almost always home. They didn't get in trouble. They didn't outwardly discuss these dark, depraved, violent fantasies they had, outside of sitting and talking with each other. So as far as April and David were concerned, their sons were perfectly fine. Their rapidly expanding collection of knives, that was just normal boy stuff. Boys will be boys. Or whatever. Outside of Crystal, I don't think a single person in that house had any sort of, even a whiff of an inkling of what was truly coming down the pipeline towards them at the hands of Robert and Michael. And regretfully, that does bring us to the evening of July 22nd, 2015. The night that would change everything. That was the night that these two horrible boys put their god-awful plan into action. And what is almost incomprehensible about that fact is that these boys chose that night pretty much on a whim. I guess what happened was that Robert had been systematically ordering a bunch of guns and ammo and stuff, all of which was set to be delivered to the house. And so when they realized that thousands of rounds of ammunition were about to show up on their doorstep the following day, well, they were pretty sure that their parents weren't going to dismiss that as easily as they had dismissed their little knife collection. Something told Robert that a mobile armory showing up at their front door might set off a few alarm bells. So this meant that the only logical option left was for them to put their plan into action that very night. They figured that night, before their package arrived in the mail the following day, they would gear up and they would throw it down. One by one, they were going to mercilessly slaughter their entire family. And horrifically, that is exactly what they went on to do. Well, it's what they went on to attempt to do. Based off of what they knew about each of their family members and each person's typical nighttime routine, the boys sat alone in their room, planning out the exact order of operations, so to speak, that they figured would most efficiently get the job done. And y'all, they really thought that they ate with this little plan, as the kids these days would say. What is it? They thought they ate and left nary a crumb. Their I's were dotted, their T's were crossed, and they were ready to spring into action. They had not a single ounce of fear or apprehension between the two of them. At least not that I'm aware of. Actually, I know they didn't, because Robert went on to write in his journal that his only fear going into the night was that he wouldn't be able to hold his knife steadily enough. So yeah, maybe that'll give you just a little more insight into the mind of a deranged 18-year-old boy. Now, their plan was for Crystal, their 13-year-old little sister. She was supposed to be their first victim. Almost every night, she and April would convene in the living room to watch TV together. And seeing as though that evening proved to be no different, the first step in their plan was for Michael to schmooze Crystal out of the living room and into he and Robert's room. I think he told her that he and Robert wanted to show her something on the computer, which was located in their room, and likely thinking absolutely nothing of this request, Crystal got up, she followed her brother into his room, and just as she walked in and took a look at the computer, Robert ambushed her. He brutally and viciously attacked his own little sister with one of the many knives that she had coincidentally been so worried about all this time. But seeing as though his only reference for murder was either movies or internet videos, Robert was under the impression that once he got a hold of Crystal, she would go down easily. And more importantly, he thought she would go down quietly, which she certainly did not. She yelled, she screamed, she fought back. She did exactly the opposite of everything that Robert and Michael had anticipated she would. And good for her, because fuck them kids. They had been planning this night forever. I think Robert said that he had been wanting and planning to kill his family for like 5 years at that point. But still, even with all of their planning and their scheming, somehow, right out of the gate, their little mission was proving to be a lot more difficult than either of the boys could have anticipated. Isn't that sad? No, what is actually sad is that from that point on, pretty much all hell broke loose within the Bever home. Upon hearing Crystal screaming and fighting for her life, April quickly sprinted out of the living room and into the boys' room, as one does when you hear absolute chaos and calamity coming from a room in your house. And likely before she could even really process the absolute horror she had just ran into, Robert turned, he squared up to his mother, and he began furiously and barbarically stabbing at her. Speaking as a mother, I literally, not even for 1 second, can I imagine the absolute terror, of course, but more than that, just the deep and primal sadness that someone would have to be feeling in a moment like that. Learning right there, when it's too late, that your own child not only wants you dead, but that they want to get rid of you so badly that they are willing to kill you by their very own hands. And with a knife, no less. Like, that is just such an up-close and personal type of attack. God, it is hard to even try to process. Now, contrary to the yarn he would try to spin later, once Michael thought Crystal had been taken care of and that she was no longer of any interest to them, seeing Robert now working on their mother, of course, he wanted to join in. He too began stabbing her in this just horrific and frenzied blitz attack. I think it was later determined that he even at one point slit April's throat. So all in all, April Bever was stabbed upwards of 50 times that night, sustaining wounds to her head, her neck, her torso, her arms, and her hands. She also had pretty significant blunt force trauma to her head, and I'm honestly not even sure exactly where that came from. I don't know which boy caused it. I don't know with what they caused it. And realistically, I probably don't want to know. I'm sure collectively we can all just imagine. By the way, sorry. Yes, I know this is a lot. It's definitely a tough one to unpack, even just at this point. And unfortunately, I am not even halfway through the events of this horrible evening. Once April went down and Crystal, to the boys' knowledge, was incapacitated, they then moved on, finally heading out of their own bedroom, looking and prowling for their next victims. Like fucking animals. And unfortunately, right at that very moment, that was when their little brother had decided to come out of his room and see what all the commotion was about. This poor kid came out of his room, clearly having no idea what to expect. Just like his mother, he was just trying to see what was going on. He opens the door, he creeps out into the hall, and much to his shock and horror, he was immediately met with his older brother Robert, wielding a knife at him and clearly trying to kill him. Now, little Daniel actually did manage to get away from his unhinged, blade-wielding maniac of a brother momentarily. He ran into him in the hall, and Robert did get a good slice into his arm with the knife before he could get away completely unscathed. However, as he drew the blade back again in an attempt to stab again, Daniel did manage to turn, run back into his bedroom, and lock the door. And truly, I cannot even begin to stress to you just how important it is that Daniel made it back into his room. By the grace of sweet little baby Jeebus, one of the family's cell phones just so happened to be in his room at the time of Michael and Robert's attack. So after narrowly escaping Robert in the hall, Daniel was able to grab this phone and he called 911. And honestly, had Daniel not made that phone call, I don't know how much further Michael and Robert might have made it in their killing spree. And dude, this 911 call, it is so fucking sad. This poor little boy is obviously so just beyond scared. He's hurt. He's out of breath. You can tell he's trying to be quiet. It is really harrowing to listen to. And as awful and sad as that part is, it's the next part that really fucking gets me. If you'll remember, Daniel's only seen Robert acting crazy so far. So as he's on the phone, he is 1000% under the impression that Robert alone is attacking their family. So when Michael knocked on his door and pretended to be scared and begged to be let in to safety, acting on purely impulse to save his big brother, Daniel opened his bedroom door. And of course, waiting on the other side of it were both Michael and Robert. They were both wielding knives and they were just waiting to bum rush into the room as soon as Daniel unlatched that door. They busted in, they snatched the phone right out of their little brother's hand, and then together they proceeded to viciously attack him. In total, Daniel was stabbed 21 times, leaving him with wounds to the back, the shoulder, and the chest. And then, considering Michael's "help me, I'm scared" ruse had worked so well on Daniel, as the boys made their way to the bathroom where little Victoria and Christopher were hiding, they decided to also pull that same damn stunt. With Michael pretending to be scared of big, scary Wobbot, these two once again tricked their little siblings, who, mind you, were just 10 and 5 at the time, manipulated and tricked them into letting them into the bathroom where they viciously and barbarically attacked both of them. Christopher was stabbed at least 21 times, taking injuries to the back, the chest, the shoulder, and the leg, while Victoria was stabbed 23 times, with her wounds landing in her neck, her chest, her back, and her arm. And even with the absolute carnage and total and complete horror that these horrible boys had unleashed on their family thus far, they still weren't done. Pretty much right after they had concluded slaughtering Christopher and Victoria, that is when the commotion of everything that had been going on throughout this enormous house finally traveled upstairs and woke David up. And without even having the slightest clue as to what he was truly in for, David flew down the stairs to see what on earth could possibly be going on. And when he realized not only what was going on, but who was actually responsible, without even giving it a second thought, David charged at Robert like a bull. Sadly, though, as David did attack Robert, Robert stabbed him repeatedly. The first strike landed to David's face. However, once Robert had secured the upper hand, it appears as though he went completely mental on damn near every inch of his father's entire body. David was ultimately stabbed almost 30 times, all across the face, the neck, and the torso, as well as in his arm and in his hand. And just like that, 5 people brutally attacked, 5 people savagely ambushed, 4 lives snuffed out as if they were nothing. However, notice I said 4 lives ended, not 5. That is because in the midst of all of this madness, after the brothers had attacked Crystal, they failed to notice that she had actually managed to crawl her way out of their room, out of the house, and into the front yard in an attempt to save herself. Frustratingly, though, once the boys had completed the attack on the rest of the family, Robert did see her. He went out in the front yard, he scooped up his sister, and he dragged her right back into that house, all while trying to suffocate her, this time, by covering her nose and her mouth. Thank God, though, that Crystal was much, much smarter than her big brother. In that moment, she thought that perhaps if she went completely limp and if she played dead, maybe, just maybe, he would believe it and he would leave her be. If she could convince him she was already dead, maybe then she could hold on long enough for someone to get there and hopefully to help her. Something that, completely unbeknownst to Crystal, was actually already in motion, thanks to her brother Daniel's 911 call. In response to said call, 2 uniformed officers were already en route to what they understood to be a domestic disturbance. Little did they know the reality of the actual nightmare they were about to walk into. Ooh, girl, it did not take them long, though, to figure out that things beyond the front door of 709 Magnolia Court were very, very bad. Immediately upon approaching the Bever home, police discovered blood on the walkway leading up to the house. They found blood on the front porch. There was blood smeared across the front door itself. It was beyond clear that something truly horrific had happened at that house that evening. Obviously, we know that this blood specifically was left from when Crystal had tried to escape, and coincidentally, it was in this moment, as these cops were staring at her blood trail, that from inside, all of a sudden, they heard just the tiniest, meekest, faintest little desperate cry for help. Mind you, at this point, only 1 additional officer had even made it to the scene, so there were 3 there total. And this trio still didn't have a single solitary clue as to what possibly lay beyond that front door. But in that moment, it truly really didn't even matter anymore. Once they were sure they had heard what they thought they had, that tiny little cry for help was the only thing in the entire world that mattered to them. They had to get into that house. They had to get to the source of that voice, and they had to help whomever was in there, possibly fighting for their life. And so, without any additional backup, police kicked in the Bever family's front door. They rushed into the house, where they were immediately met with poor little Crystal lying in the entryway, begging for help and choking on her own blood. Dude, Crystal is such a little fighter. Even in the midst of actively fighting just to stay alive, she used every last ounce of strength that she could muster up in her brutalized little body. She pulled it all together, and she told police exactly who was responsible for what had happened to she and her family. Her own 2 older brothers, Michael and Robert Bever. Crystal was rushed to the hospital and into life-saving surgery basically as soon as police walked her out of that house. Thankfully, paramedics had shown up on the scene by that point, as had a ton of backup for those initial 3 officers. As I've alluded to ad nauseum at this point, this kind of thing just did not happen in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. So as these officers were hearing this report come over their radio, it was immediately understood that this was a all hands on deck type sitch. But before we get into that, before police really start making their way through the house and discovering the true gravity of what had unfolded there that evening, I'm going to take my break and throw on my lashes. Don't go nowhere. All right, so we're back. Lashes are on, and unfortunately, that means it is time to forge ahead in our story. Just before our break, police were about to make their way through the Bever household, and as they did, they systematically and methodically, room by room and one by one, discovered the savagely massacred bodies of April, Daniel, Christopher, Victoria, and David. It was one of the grisliest scenes, if not the grisliest scene, that most of these officers had ever encountered. This family had not just been murdered, they had been totally and completely brutalized. I mean, seeing what had been done to the other members of this family, police couldn't believe that Crystal had managed to cling to her life until they'd arrived. Given the extensive injuries she'd sustained, injuries not dissimilar to the ones that had completely wiped out the majority of the rest of her family, truly, the fact that she is still here today is nothing short of an absolute miracle. Altogether, the Bever family suffered a total of about 150 knife wounds, and like I said, this collectively made this hands down, without a doubt, one of the most horrific crime scenes in Broken Arrow's history. And they've already drawn this conclusion before ever even clearing the entire home. They still had a whole other floor of the house that needed to be searched. Police had discovered a body in damn near every single room of this house that they had been through so far. So as they made it to the top floor of the home, their hearts dropped when they noticed what appeared to be a baby's nursery. And y'all, I have seen interviews with a lot of the officers that actually responded to this scene, and I don't think a single one of them has been able to make it through recalling this portion of the story without breaking down into tears and needing a moment to gather themselves. The sheer horror that they must have felt, thinking that a sweet, innocent little baby could have potentially been wrapped up in this absolute nightmare, it is enough to make you physically ill. Thankfully, though, by the grace of whatever you yourself might believe in, sweet little baby Autumn had actually made it through her brother's insanity completely unscathed. And obviously, that's a relief no matter what, but when you take into consideration that the boy's plan was to take her out with the rest of the family via decapitation, something I could literally throw up over if I thought about it long enough. Like I said, it is by the grace of some sort of guardian angel that the boys were in such a hurry to get out of the house as they heard sirens approaching. Actually, I think they were just leaving the house out the back door when they heard police's initial knocks on the front door. But whatever the reason, these boys, they simply just plumb forgot to carry out the plans they had of killing and decapitating their 2-year-old baby sister. As I'm sure you can likely imagine, finding this completely unharmed, sleeping little baby, it was truly a joyous moment. It was a tiny glimmer of a silver lining that, even if just for a moment, it helped to break up the distress and the outrage that these police officers were feeling through every step they had taken through that home that evening. That said, though, trust and believe that police were all too quickly fucking thwomped right back into the reality of the situation. The fact that this little girl's almost entire family was dead. Everything she had known for her entire short life was just gone in the blink of an eye. And most importantly, at least in that specific moment, was the fact that the two people that were allegedly responsible, they were still in the wind. Thankfully, though, the search for the remaining Bever brothers would not last much longer. Just minutes after Autumn was rescued, canine officers actually managed to pick up the brothers' scent off the back door and heading back out through the woods behind the family's property. And this kicked off a widespread, full-scale search from the human as well as the goodest boy officers. Don't let me! Can you imagine anything more stressful than this? Police still don't exactly have a total grasp on what they're up against. I mean, they know it's not good, but they're coming across bloody and discarded body armor strewn throughout the woods. They know these boys weren't opposed to taking innocent lives. Seriously, what are they running towards? Were they about to be ambushed? Were they running towards booby traps? Were the boys already gone? They had absolutely no freaking clue. As luck would have it, though, the boys were apparently not prepared to take on basically the entirety of the Broken Arrow police force. I think it was honestly like 10 minutes or less before the dogs led police straight to them. Michael and Robert were ultimately found hiding in some bushes, and once they were surrounded and at gunpoint, Robert willingly and without incident surrendered. Michael, on the other hand, well, Michael was a little less compliant. At the start of their little standoff, he refused to come out of the bush, and once police had had enough, they ended up releasing the dogs, who then drug Michael out by his grubby little shoulder. That's why his shirt's all torn to shit, by the way, in the pictures from right after their arrest. For the most part, I'd have to say that their apprehension went a lot smoother than I think the police were expecting it to. And on the subject of their apprehension, look, we all know I'm just your friendly neighborhood, inconsistent at best YouTuber, right? I am certified and trained in absolutely nothing. I have not a space in this world to be diagnosing anyone with anything. But listening to the officers that arrested these freaks recount their behavior following their apprehension for slaughtering almost their entire family, I have just one question. And that question, is what the fuck? It is giving psycho, as in psychopathy. It is definitely serving a shallow emotional response and a distinct lack of empathy. These boys were talking to these officers about killing their family as if it was just some regular schmegular, just everyday shit. Saying things like, wow, that wasn't like it is in the movies, or I thought it would only take one cut and they'd die. I beg your finest fucking pardon? Oh, and then one of them, I think it was Robert speaking to Michael, but honestly, I can't be fucking bothered to tell these two apart most of the time. Truly, if I accidentally flash up a picture of Michael, but it's actually Robert or vice versa, that's my business. If you happen to notice that, if you could just do me a favor, ignore it and keep on watching. But yeah, I think it was Robert talking to Michael saying that the evening had been a pleasure and that he was proud of what they had done. Okay. This is what I was talking about, by the way, at the beginning when I said that these boys give me the fucking heebie-jeebies. This is that. They have no remorse. They have no empathy. They have absolutely no concern for any of what they had just done. They were cold and detached and just, it's freaky. I even sent my sister the mugshots of the boys with pretty much no context, and even she thought that they were like skeevy as hell. So it's not just me. And honestly, I don't think it's just she and I. I really can't imagine that thinking that these two are creepy is like a hot take or anything. You know, I'm not anticipating a lot of people taking up for these losers in the comments. All I'm saying is that these two boys just permeate this like creep factor that even someone who knows nothing about them can easily detect. Anyway, let me rein it back in. So once the police got the boys to the station, they took each of them into separate interview rooms before they then proceeded to conduct Michael's interview first. And dude, the interview footage of Michael explaining he and Robert's process, him walking police through their plans and through their goals. There was no more emotion in that kid's voice in talking about killing his entire family than I would expect to hear from someone ordering food through a drive-thru. Honestly, people get fucking wild over their food sometimes, so I really wouldn't be surprised if I found out that there were people who do get more worked up ordering food through a drive-thru than Michael did in talking about attempting to massacre his entire family.
A furious young woman takes out her frustration on a McDonald's drive-thru window, punching it out when she can't get her hands on an order of chicken McNuggets.
Evidently, according to Michael, their plan, which I briefly covered earlier, was to kill their family, move all of their bodies up to the attic, wait a couple of days to retrieve the ammo, and then they would just pile into the old family Yukon and head out. Just bon voyage, nothing to see here. And honestly, bless these officers, because even in sitting here, listening to this kid recount the unspeakable things that he did, as well as the things that he and Robert had planned to do, these cops were still trying desperately to give this kid some benefit of the doubt. They were sitting here and listening to him and thinking that surely there had to have been something off within this family that served as a catalyst for everything that had happened leading up to this point. There had to be some form of abuse or some breakdown within the family's mental health. Just something. Anything. And I think that's just human nature. I think that's why the true crime genre exists to begin with. People have this desperate, like primal need to try to understand these things and to try to explain what got things from point A to point B like this. It's almost as if finding some sort of understanding is going to help to prevent these things from ever happening to us. But scarily, at least within Michael's initial interview, the only motive detectives were able to pry out of him was that he and Robert wanted to become famous for killing people. They wanted notoriety, and their family just happened to be standing in the way of that, meaning that their deaths had to be where this whole thing started. With that said, Michael did actually try to backtrack a little in his initial interview. He tried to claim that he didn't actually kill any of his family. Rather, he asserted that Big Brother Robert had actually been the one to attack everyone that evening, obviously.
Sure, Jan.
Of course, we know that that's a hot, steaming pile of bullshit, and even though police hadn't technically closed the case yet, I'm here to tell you that they weren't buying the story for even half a quarter of a fraction of a second either, because based solely on what they had seen in that house with their own 2 eyeballs, they just knew that there was no freaking way. So then they moved on to questioning Robert. Now, frustratingly, I believe as part of his plea agreement, which, sorry, spoiler alert, I guess.
Oops.
But for some reason, Robert's interview has been completely sealed from the public. So because of this, I can really only go off of the few things from in the interview that police have released to the public. And ultimately, that boils down to the fact that Robert, he was pretty much the polar opposite of Michael as far as talking went. Now, don't for a second misconstrue that to mean that he all of a sudden had a sense of guilt or remorse, because that was not even slightly the case. Trust me, he certainly did not try to hide the fact that he was obviously proud of what he had done. I'm just saying that unlike his brother, Robert was actually quite eager to talk to police and to tell them exactly what he had done. Honestly, it seems like he was expecting them to almost be proud of him, like they were going to be impressed with him or something. Again, I haven't seen the actual interview footage the same way that I have unfortunately seen Michael's, but I don't think I have to stretch before taking the leap and assuming that it was full to the brim with just all sorts of sick and twisted, delusional type shit. Not to say that it wasn't helpful to the overall investigation, because it definitely was. So, pros and cons and all that. Robert told police everything that we've already gone over. He told them all about he and Michael's plans and their aspirations, but he also told them exactly, point by point, how everything played out that night. He told them exactly how each and every attack had gone down. He confidently recounted to the police who all he'd stabbed, and perhaps even just slightly more important than that, he told officers who all Michael stabbed, which shockingly was not no one. And then, of course, once Michael knew that his brother had sold his ass out, he too then started singing a different tune. Still not the right one, though. No, his next attempt was the, "oh, I only helped him so that he wouldn't kill me too" defense. Another one of the oldest tricks in the book. I think that one falls right behind "I didn't do it and I don't know how that got there." Personally, I just think that getting caught as quickly as they had was not something Michael was expecting. I think that finding himself in the position he was in now, he was freaking out. The consequences of these actions weren't all Robert had hyped them up to be. Now he's stuck trying to figure out how he can talk his way out of this hot steaming pile of you-know-what that he'd found himself waist deep in. And you know what? I don't think that he thought that this was all that fun anymore. Ultimately, both Michael and Robert would be charged with 5 counts each of first-degree murder, as well as with an additional assault and battery with intent to kill charge regarding what they'd done to Crystal. If convicted, given the fact that he was over the age of 18 at the time of the murders, Robert was actually potentially facing the death penalty. And then, even though Michael was only 16 when the murders took place, the DA did ultimately have to try him as an adult. You make adult choices, you commit adult crimes, you face adult consequences. That said, though, Michael was not eligible to be put to death if he did end up being found guilty. When push came to shove, though, neither brother would actually end up facing the needle, the chair, or the squad. And you know who Robert has to thank for this? For essentially saving his life? Crystal. Yes, the little sister whose throat he had slit before then wiping out the rest of his family. She turned around and basically saved his life. When she spoke to the prosecution going up against her brother, although he had viciously tried to rob her of her life, she refused to do the same. She specifically asked that the state not seek the death penalty when they took Robert to trial. She wanted the shortest and least invasive trial possible. She didn't want to have to jump through the hoops or be raked over the coals that it would have taken for the state to pursue a death penalty case against her brother. She wanted him to get life in prison so that she could simply walk away and never look back. She just wanted this all to be over. And I will tell you what, she is a much bigger person than me, because I would have told him to light his ass up. My petty ass, I would have asked if I could have personally pulled the plug. To clarify, objectively, I'm actually not hugely for the death penalty. Sure, I understand that there's instances where it makes sense. Overall, though, I just think it's hugely overused here in America. But putting myself in Crystal's position, if someone had tried to kill me and then taken out like 3/4 of the rest of my family, I'm sorry, but in my eyes, you have vastly worn out your welcome here in the land of the living. Okay? It's time for you to head on out. Bye-bye. Look, I talk a big game, but honestly, no one on earth could possibly know how they would react in a situation like this unless they have lived it themselves. And given the incredibly fragile state she was in conjunction with just how badly they needed her testimony to go well, the state did opt to concede to Crystal. They took the death penalty off of the table, and instead they knocked Robert's maximum potential sentence down to life in prison. Following this, the prosecution actually went on to extend an offer of 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole to Robert in lieu of a trial. And after giving it a once-over, old boy happily accepted. Seriously, tell me he does not look tickled fucking pink in most of his mugshots. Michael, on the other hand, he wasn't planning on going down that easily. He still had a little fight in him. For the first time in his life, rather than just copying what Robert did, pleading guilty and sparing his remaining family the anguish of a long, drawn-out trial, Michael instead decided that he was crazy. Together with his lawyers, Michael decided that he was mentally unwell and that therefore he simply could not be held legally culpable for any part he may or may not have played in the murders of his family. I mean, I won't argue on the mentally unwell part. However, I will not stand for the no legal culpability part. He can take that and he can stick it where the sun don't shine. Not legally culpable. Get the fuck out of here. But y'all, I will give it to Michael's attorney because he came to play when it came to defending this degenerate waste of space. He tried to get his confession tossed down. He tried to get his charges reduced. He wanted him to be charged as a juvenile instead of an adult. And of course, the cherry on top of the shit sundae that was Michael's defense, his lawyer tried to prove that he wasn't mentally fit to premeditate anything. He was like the little lawyer that could, except for the fact that he absolutely, most certainly, could not. For starters, according to Oklahoma law, minors over the age of 15 that are charged with first-degree murder have to be charged as an adult. So take that, combined with Crystal's story, as well as Michael's blood having been found on some of the knives used on the evening of the massacre, neither he nor his lawyer really stood much of a chance. Michael's trial began in April of 2018, and it lasted for just about 6 weeks. Crystal ultimately was called to testify, forcing her again to recount in painstaking detail everything that had went down the horrific night that her own 2 brothers had tried to kill her. And she, of course, had to do this with Michael sitting in the courtroom and staring directly at her. Much like Sandra last week, Crystal is yet another incredibly tough little girl who took her fear and her trauma, and instead of letting it consume her, she channeled it into securing justice for herself as well as the less fortunate ones from the night of her attack. Crystal wasn't the only sibling, though, of Michael's that ended up taking the stand throughout the 6 grueling weeks of testimony. Because on top of wanting to hear what Crystal had to say, the court was also, of course, hugely interested in hearing Robert's side of the story. While on the stand, Robert testified to having allegedly experienced abuse while enrolled in a local preschool, and he asserted that that was actually what led April to have this obsession with keeping her kids home and safe from the outside world. However, in stark contradiction to the supposed safety that April was trying to provide, Robert claimed that David then was actually routinely abusive towards he and his siblings. And let me just say right here that I am never not going to feel overwhelming empathy for a child or children that were mistreated. But it is still no excuse for the bloodbath that Robert and Michael were responsible for. How the fuck does an abusive father justify the brutal slaying of your defenseless little siblings? Sure, Crystal corroborated these allegations of abuse within her own testimony, and of course I feel sadness for the fact that Robert and Michael had to go through that. It just does not negate that they themselves then grew up and made this decision to viciously wipe out their entire family. Really, the only main takeaway that anyone ever seems to get from Robert's testimony is how inappropriate his demeanor was while he was testifying. At the risk of repeating myself again, this motherfucker is spooky. There is just no other way to put it. He was apparently smiling and laughing and giggling pretty much the entire time he was on the stand. Like, you are testifying about your supposed physical and sexual abuse, as well as recounting how you murdered almost your entire family. Read the room, bro. Yeah, and Michael was the one that shot for the insanity defense. In my opinion, if anyone should have pled mentally unwell based on mugshots alone, it probably should have been Robert. Old boy looks straight up crazy in his latest prison portrait. Honestly, it really didn't matter, though. It was very clear to the jury, pretty much from the start of Robert's testimony, that his goal was to try to deflect blame from his little brother. Robert had clearly told investigators during his own confession that Michael had also done a fair bit of stabbing on the night the family was killed, but then in this official court testimony, he is trying to backpedal and state under oath that he was the only one who stabbed anyone the night that his family was killed. Michael didn't so much as nick even a single of their fallen family members. Sounds like bullshit to me, my guy, but it's your broken oath, not mine. Do your thing, just perjure away. Of course, Robert's claims also completely contradicted Crystal's account of what had happened that horrible night, along with going completely against some of his own past statements. So thankfully, in the end, the jury was much more moved by Crystal's testimony and much more inclined to believe her story. Once testimony wrapped up and deliberations began, it only took the jurors 6 hours to return, having found Michael Bever guilty of each and every single charge he was tried for. They recommended that he be sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 38 years. However, following the verdict, the judge instead took it upon himself to sentence Michael to 5 consecutive life terms for the murders of his family, as well as to 28 additional years for his part in the attack on Crystal. Meaning that, rightfully so, both of these wretched, awful, horrible young men will spend the rest of their natural-born lives here on Earth behind bars. Michael's lawyer did attempt to appeal his sentence. He filed on the grounds that 5 consecutive life sentences could be considered cruel and unusual, therefore arguing that the sentence violated the 8th Amendment. But the Supreme Court saw things much differently, and ultimately they did decide to uphold Michael's life sentences. So no parole for Mikey. Oh, and by the way, unlike the Fryer brothers last week, which, yes, I am in fact still mad about, this time around, according to Oklahoma law, because Michael and Robert were co-conspirators in their crime, they're actually not allowed to be housed within the same facility. Robert is currently serving his sentence at Oklahoma State Penitentiary, while Michael is currently being housed at Lexington Correctional Center. And I doubt I'm alone in voicing my hopes that these 2 ingrates are having just the worst time possible. I don't know much about how Michael's handling lockup, but I do know that Robert, he's still running around acting like a complete fucking fool behind bars. Yeah, not too long after his incarceration, he attacked 2 prison staff members with a frickin' 8-inch shank. So clearly, he ain't learned no damn lessons from lockup so far. If my memory serves me, I believe it was a prison psychologist as well as a social worker, I think. Whatever their titles, though, Robert snuck up on them. He grabbed one of them from behind, and he tried to stab them. Thankfully, the other was quickly able to disarm him and to get him in a headlock before he was actually able to cause any real damage. But it very easily could have gone a different way. Subsequently, for this act of absolute tom-fucking-foolery, Robert ended up seeing himself seated with an additional 3 concurrent life sentences set to run consecutively to his previous 5 life sentences. Like, honestly, just throw the whole man away at this point. Serving what? 8 life sentences at this point? What a mess. Oh, and that reminds me, I guess he did apparently at one point attempt to take his own life. He tied a sheet to a bed and then around his neck, and I don't really care enough about him to try and figure out the logistics or the mechanics behind all of it, but really all that matters is that it didn't work, and unfortunately, like I said, he is still haunting the halls of Oklahoma State Pen to this day. Following the absolute nightmare of the 2015 massacre, the Bever family home actually did sit vacant and unoccupied for quite a while. There was seemingly an attempt to burn the house down sometime, I believe in 2016, so like a year after the murders. And of course, it's highly suspected that this was the product of arson. Just given the general feelings of animosity and like ick towards the home and towards what the boys had done, I definitely don't think it's far-fetched to believe that someone would have wanted that memory gone and out of the community for good. However, part of the house did still stand following this attempt, so ultimately the city chose to purchase the land, finally ordering for the official demolition by an actual hired crew sometime in 2017. Once the house was gone and the land was clear, the city actually drew up plans for a park that they hoped to erect in place of the home. The park was called Reflection Park. It was opened in 2019, and basically it's meant to serve as something positive and something beautiful that was able to come out of such a truly horrific and awful event. An event that, honestly, I think completely changed the city of Broken Arrow forever. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Rest in peace to the members of the Bever family whose lives were coldly and callously taken from them by 2 people that they should have been able to trust and that they should have been able to rely on. David, April, Daniel, Christopher, and Victoria, they all should have had so much life left ahead of them, and the fact that they were killed in such a horrific and such a terrifying way, there really are no words. It is just so unthinkable, and it's so sad. This case really is just devastating and gut-wrenching. Wherever Crystal and Autumn are today, I hope that they're doing all right. I hope that they've been able to rebuild some semblance of a family. And with that, I also so desperately hope that they're getting the help and support that I'm sure they need. Once the dust had settled and the trials had ended and Crystal was fully recovered, she and Autumn were temporarily placed in the custody of the state before eventually being formally adopted by a family in Tulsa. Beyond that though, and rightfully so with everything they've been through, details regarding their exact whereabouts and what their lives look like presently, all of that is being kept private in order to protect the girls as well as their new family. So yeah. That is the story of the Bever brothers, and that is the case of the Broken Arrow murders. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. And of course, thank you so much again to Jennifer for requesting this one. Even though it was just... If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the case submission form that I have linked down in the description. And if by chance you're interested in anything about today's makeup, I will also make sure to have all of the information and the links for the products I used today listed down there for you as well. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every 10 days. The date of my next video should be somewhere on the screen here for you. But if you turn on your post notifications, you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one. Until then though, stay safe and have a good week. Bye! To Oklahoma, circle the late 19th circle. I hate it here. To Oklahoma, circle the late circle. I said it again. Oh my fucking god. Robert Davis Bever. I think we all know my Google curiosity or a fascination that essentially spoon-fed the boys their obviously staring at her Thankfully though, what the fuck is happening? Oh, my technology trying to kill me. Through the wood. What the fuck am I saying? So then they moved on to crush and never look back. Bitch, we're done. Ha!